So, welcome to this content on biological approaches to personality. So, we are going to cover this content, but before we do, I wanted to give you some feedback on your reflections and the inventory comments. So, the scale assignments now, you're asked to do a personality inventory, and then I ask you to critique it. And generally, what I mean is to answer, does it seem to fit you? Does it seem to match with you? And then what did you think of the scale? How well did you think the scale measured what it purported to measure, And so I'd like you to think about that when you're doing these scales, like actually look at each item and answer it, but then also look at the item itself and give some feedback. And this person wrote one that I particularly liked. I like certain aspects of it, especially the critical aspect. So this person summarized the work first, wrote, Mark Snyder was a modern psychologist that had a different approach to understanding the self, developing a way to look at self-monitoring. And this is what I liked in terms of the critique. So beginning in the third sentence, while taking the self-monitor survey of Snyder, I saw questions that were based on a person that goes to parties, and I believe more of a Western concept of this person that would be drawn around. I believe some of the questions need to portray the up-to-date culture that all may relate to, getting a better picture of self-monitoring. Some of the questions, I believe, are a little culturally biased, meaning that for someone of lower or minority groups who are working around the farm, this would be difficult to try and put yourself in the situation of. If they consider themselves a person who is the life of the party question, which I would think if a person is not around that type of social life, then one can only imagine. And I really like the content of this critique because this is exactly what we're doing when we look at these scales. If you ever develop a scale, you're going to be part of this group who's critiquing it and saying, oh, this might not work for this population, or this might be a little outdated, or this phrase, life of the party, that phrase doesn't work for everyone. It's maybe just typical of Western culture, and in particular the dominant culture. So this was really valuable feedback. So when you're writing these, I would say in terms of this person's response, this first sentence, this first stuff right here is okay. It's not even necessary, but this critique, this is really important. And I think this particular answer could have added just a little bit more about their own personal did they think that whatever their score was on the self-monitoring scale, does that seem aligned with what is true of them? That would be the other thing that I would like to see. And then also you can see as I read it, there's some awkward phrasing and sentences and things like that. So I think also putting this through a grammar check in Word would also have helped just to clean up the writing a little bit. But overall, this is a really good example of critique, particularly beginning with this while taking the self-monitoring survey. Really nice critique, and so I wanted to bring this one forward to you so we start to get the idea on these. And then this was a journal reflection, just a paragraph from a reflection that I just found also really interesting. If we were in class, we could talk about it a little bit. But this person wrote, this was just one paragraph in a longer response. And this person wrote, Erickson's 8 stages of development really had me thinking whether or not I have completed my stages in life. And it reminded me of the Navajo perspective of living a life and the stages to be completed living life on the corn pollen path. There are 4 major ceremonies that should be completed in order to live a Navajo life in harmony. And then she describes these 4 stages. Each stage of development has to be successfully completed, or the next stage will come with hardship and identity issues. I find this to be truth. I have met individuals who have admitted to not having their rites of passage ceremony, and they say themselves that because they have not completed that part of their life is the reason they struggle, and why their children struggle living life presently. Navajos connect their ability to live a life in harmony to the successful completion of their life ceremonies. I believe this is why I can relate to Erikson's psychosocial development theory more than any others. And I think this is just really a beautiful parallel, you know, a linkage to a Navajo traditional belief that would be really relevant to people. And I will add that we in Western culture, we have what's called discontinuous, I'm getting the wrong phrase, excuse me. We have a gradual approach to development. So there aren't any rites of passage along the Western path. I mean, there are some small ones, you know, there's high school graduation, and some religions have confirmations of faith and things like that. But there's no society-wide rites of passage that mark one stage to the next. There's just subtle things like getting a driver's license or becoming old enough to drink, or, you know, so it's just not as clearly demarcated. And Joseph Campbell, whom I've mentioned before, touts really quite the importance of having these rites of passage, having a ceremony, you know, that's respected and guided by elders, and that after the ceremony you're treated differently by others. Maybe there is a little bit of hardship before the ceremony. Maybe there are differences after, like a different name or a different way of interacting. And he thinks that these things are really important, and that this might be a challenge in Western culture, the absence of these ceremonies. And in any case, my comment on this writing is this is the kind of, like, this is a beautiful parallel. And I also like that she didn't just draw the parallel intellectually, but then she brought it back home to personal experience. So this was a really nice, I really appreciated reading this insightful comment as well. All right, let's go on to our comment. So we talked about these twins a little bit, and in our class time we started to talk about why we have a picture of twins right here on biological approaches to personality, and I began to share about monozygotic and dizygotic twins, meaning identical twins, same egg, same sperm, and fraternal twins, which are 2 eggs, 2 sperm. So they're no more alike than siblings. And because siblings who are identical have exactly the same DNA, we can begin to understand how much a trait is genetically based. So if you have the exact same DNA, the biological material as another person, then any differences in your personality must be attributable to environment. So it helps us tease out what aspects of personality are in the genes. So we're going to be covering the heritability of personality and the brain structure and function of the brain and how it impacts personality. The models of the relationship between personality and biology. Zuckerman's, these are the 4 models that we'll look at. And then how do biology and environment interact? Talk about attractiveness and tropisms. And then hormones and personality, in a little look at the effect of gender on personality. So here's a little bit more about these twins. Just repeating here, they share 100% of their DNA. They're monozygotic. Mono is a prefix meaning one. The zygote is the egg at the fertilized state before it implants in the uterus. So monozygotic. By looking at how similarly they develop, we can approximate the proportion of their trait that's due to genes and the proportion due to environment. And this is especially true if the monozygotic twins were raised in different homes, because then we know the effect of the genes aren't coming from the homes. So our first concept is species inheritance, evolutionary psychology. So evolutionary psychology seeks to build the case that every trait that persists in a species persists because it's adaptive. And by adaptive, we mean that it helps that either the individual or the species to survive. And so adaptive traits are physical and psychological traits that benefit both the individual and the population. All right, so People who have these kinds of traits are more likely to reproduce. This is how the mechanism works. So if you have a trait that's beneficial, then you'll be more likely to mate. You're healthy, or healthy specimen, so to speak. And because you're more likely to reproduce, there will be more people with such traits. And people who have traits that aren't adaptive, well, we will have fewer of them. So we talk about fear of snakes helps people adapt. This is the evolutionary perspective on that, rather than like the spiritual Jungian perspective. And universal expressions like the blush, well, if you can think of it being adaptive in the sense that if you commit a social error and you don't blush, people may reject you, and we need people to survive. But if you commit a social error and then that redness comes up in your face and you feel embarrassed, people are more likely to feel gentle toward you and forgive you, and you won't lose your social support, and you'll be better able to survive. So this is actually a fairly important concept. And then the partially adaptive is a sort of a subcategory of the adaptive traits. And these traits either benefit the individual or the population, but not both. And so traits that benefit the individual but harm the population. So cheaters, for example. So if a person cheats, they might get more of whatever resource it is that they're cheating to get. And so it might benefit them individually, but overall, it impedes the population. The population doesn't benefit if it consists of a lot of cheaters. And so we would think and believe that this trait of cheating, for example, would be less selected. And by that we mean people who cheat would be less likely to find a mate and reproduce. Is this always true? No, it's not always true. And so people who cheat don't necessarily fail to reproduce. In a close-knit culture, there might be social shaming. But in our large anonymous culture, people who cheat may never get exposed, and so social shaming doesn't work. And so perhaps we will have more cheaters in the future, or, people who are out for their own good. And then other traits that benefit the population but harm or impede the individual. So we can think of like soldiers, for example. Soldiers are taking the risk of dying for the betterment of all of us. And are these traits adaptive? They are. Like people who have who are soldiers tend to maybe have a lot of respect in our society, and so there's a greater risk that they're going to die, but because of the respect they get, hopefully in our society, that might make it worth it. Another way to think about it is what's called kin altruism. So kin are people who are related to us, and I think maybe in the Navajo perspective, kin might be considered like the clan. And altruism is giving without getting anything in return. Kin altruism. So giving to the clan or to the family without getting anything in return, or in a broader sense, just giving to humanity without getting anything in return. And this is another example of a trait that really doesn't benefit the individual. Like, it doesn't help you if you're giving all your stuff away, but it does help your clan or your people. And so by doing so, you might not be helping your very own specific gene line to persist, but you would be helping your general gene line to persist, the genes that you share with your siblings and clan members and family members. So we think about things this way sometimes, and this idea of adaptiveness of traits that help us get along and fit into our society. So next we move into the brain. So does the structure of the brain impact personality? So when we think about the structure of the brain, we're thinking about like the parts of the brain, the hard material in the brain. That's distinct from the function of the brain, which is sort of how the neurons are connecting and functioning and where's the activity happening. So the structure of the brain is things that are happening in certain parts. And so if your parts are different from another person's part, does that impact your personality? And so the things that we'll pay attention to here, part of the ones we'll pay attention to, are the hippocampus And that's where your memories are consolidated. It's not where memories are stored. So you'll know that if your hippocampus is damaged, your memory is impacted, but it's not because all the memories are stored in there. It's because that's where they're organized into neural pathways that can be easily accessed. Your amygdala is the center of emotion processing. So we'll see a lot of activity there if you're experiencing emotion, especially negative emotion or anger. The cerebellum is coordination of movement and other processes, so the coordination of all your sort of neural activities in alignment with your body. And the prefrontal cortex, way up in the front of your brain, is where you organize, prioritize, regulate emotion and behavior and so forth. So this helps us to like override emotion, for one thing. So if your amygdala is connected to the prefrontal cortex, and so your prefrontal cortex then can override an amygdala that's giving you an emergency symbol. And this region doesn't fully mature and connect up until the mid-20s, so it takes a long time. So this helps us to just be rational human beings here in this world. And these images, by the way, what we're looking at are MRI images, and if you can look carefully, you'll see that they seem to be going from smaller to larger, right? And that's because that's how an MRI works. It takes like scans of the brain in little slices, and it's not actually slicing your brain, it's just taking the images of those slices. And so when we have these images, we can compare your structure with the structures of like a prototype human being and see if there are differences. So one way we can know whether the structure of the brain impacts personality is by looking at people who've had some damage. And Phineas Gage is a really well-known case of someone who had damage to the brain. He was a railroad worker working with some sort of explosives, and he may have been tamping down explosives into a certain region and they went off. And the bar kind of went through his brain at the angle shown here. And so you can see that it kind of went right down and out his cheekbone, so it did some damage in certain parts of the brain and not in other parts. And you can see this image of him. He lost his eye in the end. So in particular, he had damage to his prefrontal cortex. And you'll recall that the prefrontal cortex is linked to organization, reasoning, and emotion regulation. And so before his accident, he was agreeable, he was well-liked, he was responsible, he wasn't late for work, he got there on time, he didn't skip out on work, he wasn't a drinker. After the accident, he was impulsive, he was prone to really sudden fits of anger, and he was no longer dependable. He didn't come to work on time, or he skipped work. And so we really did have some big changes in his personality after he had this injury. So we can also see other examples of injury changing a person. So people who have had a stroke sustain damage, part of their brain dies due to a blockage up in the brain. That's what a stroke is. And people who have had a stroke, depending on where their damage is, will definitely lose function. And so they might lose language function or some things like that. But if the damage happens to be in another area, they can actually change quite a bit in terms of personality as well. Another example is Alzheimer's disease. Alzheimer's disease is a condition in which especially older people get a lot of what are called amyloid plaques in their brain, which also fuzz up the processes, the ability of the brain to function. And so structure of the brain impacted, but personality can change. And even, from anger to sweetness, or someone who would never swear a word in their life all of a sudden is cussing, and it just depends on the area where the damage is. But certainly we have an impact on personality in both of these too. So a couple good examples of brain injury changing personality. So another example is a condition called Williams syndrome. And this is a genetic condition, so it's inherited. There are 25 genes when there are thousands and thousands of genes. 25 genes on the 7th chromosome causes this condition. And you'll see these images here because these are typical of what children look like. They have sort of elfish features, very full lips, especially big smiles, so often really charming looking children, but most notable for this smile and the full lips. And the characteristics, personal characteristics, are this kindness, really open, gentle, trusting. These children have a low IQ, meaning they're not functioning well in academic situations, but their social graces are absolutely over the top. They may never be able to read or write, but nevertheless they have a good spoken vocabulary. Good storytellers, they love music, like to entertain people, and again, these particular facial characteristics. And what happens when we have this anomaly on the 7th chromosome? We have less white area in the brain. So the white areas are the regions of the brain that contain like glial cells and like support cells for the brain. Does the housework, cleans the brain out. And smaller brain volume and a smaller cerebrum. And so we have a gene that results in structural differences that leads to personality differences. And here I'm going to stop the recording and ask you to go watch this little video that I have to put on separately, and that I will hopefully be able to link to it. So I'm going to embed a link on this slide that'll link to this video, and then I'm going to try to link back to the lecture if I can do it. But if I'm not able to successfully do it that way, then I'll invite you to watch the video at the end of this lecture. So another condition, Angelman Syndrome, is named after the man who discovered it. It also used to be called Happy Puppet Syndrome. And once again, we have an anomaly on just one allele, just a few genes on the 15th chromosome. In fact, in particular on the maternal allele, so the 15th chromosome that comes down from the maternal line. And what it does is it prevents myelination of some axons. And I haven't given that content to you yet, but hopefully you've learned it in some other classes. But the axon is the long strand on the neuron through which the electrical signal passes, and the myelin is like an insulation coating on the outside of that. And so if the myelination isn't there, the electrical signal is lost. So what cognitive characteristics do we have? Well, typically mental retardation and really serious cognitive challenges. So my brother has a little boy who has this condition, and he never talked, never walked. He's 28 now, and he never will walk. So very, very serious mental retardation. Physical characteristics, he looks very much like this. Even though he wouldn't have naturally been blonde, my brother is darker, the genetic anomaly causes melanin to be impaired, and melanin is what gives color to the skin and eyes. And so this child is blonde and blue-eyed. They have wide mouths, and their teeth are generally spaced out pretty far. And the personality is happy, always smiling and laughing, even having laughter as a response to inappropriate things. I remember when he was little, my brother walking across the room and tripping and bumping his leg on the coffee table and going, ah! And little Nathan just laughed and laughed and laughed. So we do have that personality characteristic linked to a genetic abnormality. And I'd say this is probably more of a functional deficit than a structural deficit, but nevertheless, it's in the hard region of the brain. So next we'll ask the question about the function of the brain. Does the function of the brain impact personality? And so this is what we're talking about. So the neural pathways and neurotransmitters in the brain. So this is what a neuron looks like. These are just the cells in your brain, just like your skin cells and everything else, all the cells in your body. But these are unique cells because these particular cells, these neurons that are within your whole nervous system, are with you way before you're born. And I don't mean just some of them, I mean all of them. So your neurons don't die and get regenerated. your neurons stay with you and in fact get stronger and learn depending on what you ask of it. So the electrical signal would come in through these dendrites. These would have receptors on them for certain chemicals. And if they get enough of a signal, they will trigger, they will fire and send an electrical signal through this axon, which you might think of as the electrical wires, down into these synaptic terminals where more chemicals that's stored in vesicles down here, the chemicals called neurotransmitters, will be released, and they will stimulate the next neuron and so on. And this is the myelin that I was referring to earlier. The myelin is this coating on the outside of the wires, outside of the axon, but metaphorically that I link to being the wire. And the myelin coats it and protects the signal so that it can get through quickly. And you'll see these little gaps, and that just allows the signal to jump faster because you need your neurons to act really, really fast. And so the dendrites, the more dendrites a neuron has, the more synapses they have, and the synapses are gaps between the neurons where the chemical, the neurotransmitter, is released. And if you have more dendrites on a particular neuron, there's more receptors, and this neuron is more likely to fire. And by the way, how do we get more dendrites? Well, we get more dendrites by using a certain neural pathway a lot. So the more we use a pathway, the more that pathway is strengthened. So I already mentioned the myelin. This is indicated in green here on the outside of the axon. The vesicles are just these little bubbles that are storing chemicals at the end, in the synaptic terminals at the end of the neuron. And if there's a signal that comes through, those vesicles open, release their hormones into the synapse. Receptors located along the dendrites, and more receptors, more responsiveness. And then the neurotransmitters not pictured here are the chemicals that are released to trigger the next neuron or to stimulate the next neuron. So here's an example of these receptors that are loaded onto the dendrites of the neuron. So what you're seeing here is the end of a neuron, and here's the axon terminal. Here are those little vesicles or bubbles containing neurotransmitter, which are the chemicals like serotonin you've probably heard of, dopamine you've probably heard of. And you can see here that then it opens up, the vesicles release their neurotransmitters into the synapse. Right here we have a dendrite of another synapse, of another neuron that is receiving these signals, and if it receives enough signal, it will fire. So that's what we're looking at here in a magnified view. And the receptors are all unique. So not every neuron has receptors for every neurotransmitter. So for instance, this neurotransmitter can only stimulate a neuron that has this receptor. Likewise, this neurotransmitter can only signal a neuron that has this receptor. And so the receptors matter, so the neurotransmitters matter, and each neurotransmitter has a little bit different role in the brain. So that's why they're different for the neurons. So what's the relationship between the function of the brain and personality? So we know that serotonin is a neurotransmitter, and we know that if an individual has more serotonin, less depression. So there's a relationship there. If they have not enough serotonin, more depression. We know that more serotonin, less obsessive compulsive disorder, OCD. So we can see that there's a relationship here between these neurotransmitters and certain characteristics or lived experiences. I would say lived experiences because these hopefully are temporary states. The neurotransmitter dopamine you can think of as the reward for everything. And so dopamine is what neurotransmitter is released when you do something that feels good and urges you to do it again. And so more dopamine, if there are enough receptors, means more sense of reward in response to action. And so a person who's depressed might not only have low serotonin, they might also have low dopamine because they're not getting rewarded for action. Nothing is feeling good to them. And feedback loops just suggest that, yes, serotonin leads to, say, reduction in depression, But at the same time, we might have a, a depressed person producing less serotonin. So we have a feedback loop going on here. Ideally, this feedback loop would cause an adjustment in the positive direction. Like if someone didn't have enough serotonin and they felt depressed, then their body would produce more serotonin to keep a homeostatic balance. But that's the anomalous thing about these neurotransmitters is there are certain characteristics that might cause them to increase or decrease, and those behaviors or thinking patterns can actually impact these neurotransmitters as well. And so it's not quite as clean a feedback loop as, for instance, in our digestive system. So let's be aware a little bit of our parasympathetic and sympathetic systems. So our sympathetic nervous system is our fight or flight response. And when something startles us or scares us, or when we're aroused or excited, these things on the right happen in our bodies. So it's under sympathetic, we can see that our pupils may dilate. We may have a flow of saliva may stop, our mouth might get dry, our heartbeat increases, our breathing increases, our bronchi are dilated or expanded. We are not digesting anymore. Our pancreas is saying, oh my gosh, need more blood sugar. We're secreting adrenaline and noradrenaline, and we're not able to, we probably evacuate. Sometimes if it's really serious, we evacuate our bladders, but otherwise we're not going to stop and go to the bathroom. So this is like our emergency alert system, and we would have these experiences both in response to good kinds of excitement, like romantic excitement, or like you're about to go on a roller coaster, but also bad kinds of things. And so the sympathetic nervous system tends to be overactive in people who have a lot of anxiety. And now one thing to note is that we all differ. So here's a personality trait. We differ in the extent to which our sympathetic nervous system is active. So some people, if someone bursts into the room yelling, some people might have a really, their heart rate might just jump up really fast and stay up a really long time. And another person, their whole body might react more calmly. And so this is a physiological reaction, but we interpret it cognitively. And so the person whose sympathetic system has really keyed up might place a different cognitive framework on it and respond to it differently than a person whose sympathetic system did not act up. And so we differ on that. And our parasympathetic is the opposite of the sympathetic. It's what calms us back down again after we're excited. So now our saliva starts flowing, our pupils come back down to size, our heartbeat slows back down, our breathing. Now we're able to secrete digestive energies again. Now we're able to go to the bathroom again if we need to. All of these are functions of our parasympathetic system. And like our sympathetic system, it varies by individual. So after that sudden scare I mentioned just a minute ago, some people will calm back down very quickly, but others it may take a longer time. Now, the other thing we're looking at here is our central nervous system. So the brain and the spinal column contains the central nervous system. So all the main functions of the body are contained here. You'll notice that all of these organs are connected up to the brain via something called the vagus nerve. So the vagus nerve takes all the information from the body and primarily relates it back up to the brain. And so, if you're calming down, then you're getting information via the vagus nerve, and actually through the heart. There are actually nerve cells in the heart, and then that information is going back up to the brain. And so you might even say some of your thoughts are impacted by the information transmitted through this vagus nerve that will allow you to feel calm. There's about 80% of your information comes up through the vagus nerve from the organs to the brain, and only 20% is coming from the brain to the organs. And so you can see that this is your body is communicating quite a lot to your brain. So sympathetic nervous system, fight or flight. What if it responds strongly to weak stimulus? That would be a personality difference, someone who gets very keyed up right away. Or what if there's a really strong stimulus and this hardly happens to you? So those are the ideas of differences. And then the parasympathetic, if you take a long time to calm down after a scare or after a burst of anxiety, it might be that your parasympathetic system is inactive or not sufficiently active. And one measure of personality that's actually linked to resilience and adaptiveness is called heart rate variability. And it isn't your heart rate per se. It's the extent to which your heart rate changes in response to different stimuli. And so in a healthy body, the heart rate will change quite a lot. You're adapting to different situations all the time, and your heart rate will change in conjunction with that so that you can adapt. And then the information coming up to your brain will tell you that you've adapted. If we measure heart rate variability and find that an individual has low levels, that individual does have poor outcomes, like children who have been subject to abuse have lower heart rate variability. And this means that their heart rate they're not adapting to new situations as quickly. And so they might be experiencing those situations with inappropriate emotional feeling or inappropriate responsiveness coming right from the body. And so this HRV, it's called, is certainly an indicator of deficiencies, or not deficiencies in the person, but a nervous system that hasn't allowed that person to respond to situations. So as I said, trauma in childhood can be a cause of this low heart rate variability. And so this person who struggles with this may have to work hard with breath and with other physiological functions to get the body to respond differently to stimuli in order to have them feel more level and steady in their emotions. So I think this might give people hope in some ways if they do have difficulty with emotions, and if they did have difficult childhood experiences, that it can be worked through from the physical level, not only from the psychological level. We can work at it within the body.